Welcome to 252. We're going to pick up basically just where we left off in 251. So we ended that class with the endocrine system, and we are going to move into the cardiovascular system now, and we're going to start our study of the cardiovascular system with blood. So this is actually showing a condition we're going to talk about, which is iron deficiency anemia. Okay, so the functions of blood. We can basically divide it into three categories. We've got the most obvious, which is distribution. So blood is a transport medium. Anything that needs to get from point A to point B is going to use your blood, and your blood is traveling very fast. So it takes about 1 minute for a red blood cell to leave your heart, cycle through the entire system, and get back to the heart. Almost your entire blood volume flows through your heart every minute. So it doesn't take long to get somewhere in your body if we are using the blood to get there. So we've got gases, blood gases we'll talk about, the nutrients and waste products that cells both need and then need to get rid of. The hormones, this is where we ended 251. They are going to utilize the blood to get to their target cells. So we've got a distributive property here. Then we have a regulation, or what I would call a homeostatic role for blood. Body temperature falls into this, so your blood is going to be routed either closer to the skin or farther away based on your body temperature. So it's going to play a role in maintaining proper temperature there, the homeostatic regulations. It's going to play a role in maintaining the proper pH of your body fluids, as well as maintaining the proper volume of fluid in your body. Those are two things we're going to get into extensively later in the semester, but it is worth noting that blood definitely plays a role in homeostasis. Third is protective. This is where the immune system and blood clotting and things like that come into play. So we first have protection against the loss of blood in the form of blood clotting, and then we have the protection against infection via the white blood cells that are going to make up a significant component of your immune system. So three different types of functions for blood. Now, blood is a connective tissue, so you should remember that from 251. It has a completely fluid matrix. So hopefully you're remembering that connective tissues have living cells in a non-living matrix. That's the big umbrella definition for all connective tissues. They're living cells in a non-living matrix. Blood is absolutely going to consist of living cells, which are called the formed elements, and a non-living matrix called the plasma. So here are all of our formed elements. So we have three different types. We've got your erythrocytes, or your red blood cells, leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. There's 5 different types of those. And then platelets, which are little fragments of other cells. So when we look at a sample of whole blood, generally the erythrocytes are going to make up about 45% of that sample, and the plasma is going to make up about 55%, which means that your leukocytes and your platelets make up less than 1% of blood. So it's mostly red blood cells and plasma. Here's kind of the factoids about your blood. So pH of blood should always be somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. That is a very tightly regulated range. We'll talk about pH imbalances later in the semester, but we don't have a very significant amount of leeway in what the pH looks like. It makes up roughly 8% of your body weight. Males generally have somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 liters, females somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5, but that will certainly scale on body size. All right, so let's talk plasma first. It's mostly water, So depending on what book you look at, you can get anywhere from about 90 to 95, maybe even 96% water. So the water component is obviously going to play a big role in terms of fluid volume and things like that. But there are over 100 different solutes dissolved in plasma that are going to give you the true functionality of it. So, in addition to our water, we've got our electrolytes. So we got a lot of sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. We've got chloride, phosphates, bicarb. These are all going to play a role. So you should kind of think, what do you already know? This is going to be an important concept in this class. What do you already know? What did you already learn? You know for a fact that there's a pretty big role for sodium and potassium. So you know that that plays a role in action potentials, muscle contraction. You know calcium plays a pretty big role in those. Well, cells have to get those electrolytes, and most of them are going to travel to cells in your plasma. Then we get our plasma proteins. So this is a major category of solutes here. We have 3 different categories when we're looking at plasma proteins. The first is going to be albumin. This is the most abundant of your plasma proteins. It makes up about 60% of all plasma proteins. This is a super important protein. It is a big, giant protein that is made by the liver. And because it is so big, it is basically stuck in your blood. It cannot filter out. Because of that, it basically functions as a water magnet. There is always going to be albumin in your blood to draw water back in. The water then is going to be important in maintaining volume. And just to kind of give you a preview, volume is going to be important in maintaining blood pressure. Blood pressure is important to maintain life. So our albumins are absolutely going to play a role in the overall function of the blood and blood pressure and the overall function of the cardiovascular system. This is a really good point to make here. I'll just take a little side note here. This is how you need to start thinking about 252 and how it is different from 251. 251 was all very straightforward. If you looked at it, it was in a straight line. We could just write out an entire process, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. 252 is not going to look like that. It's going to be a web of information. So right now we're talking about a plasma protein that's made by the liver that's going to have a significant major effect on blood pressure. Therefore, the liver is now going to be involved in blood pressure. So it's not going to be a straightforward pathway, and you need to take your mind out of that right away. The worst thing that you can do in 252 is treat the class like it's 251. So that's just a little example of that we can use right off the bat to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, that this is going to be a web of information, not a straight line. I always say that 251 is kind of like a bulleted list. You just write out little facts in a list form. 252 is going to be writing a paragraph. All of the words have to flow together. The sentence 1 has to relate to sentence 2, and sentence 3 should relate back to sentence 1. That's more of how you need to approach 252. So, all right, coming back into our plasma proteins here. That was a little side note. Second type of plasma protein is going to be a category called your globulins. These are going to make up about 36 or so % of the plasma proteins. Most of them, the alpha and beta globulins, are also produced by the liver, and they are generally going to function as transporters. So when we have iron, something like that, that needs to be transported through the blood so that we can reuse it to make hemoglobin. We're going to transport it attached to alpha and beta globulins. Lipids. So if you've ever had a lipid panel drawn and you have your LDL and HDL, those are what are called lipoproteins. So you have the lipid, which is what we're measuring, but you also have proteins. And so a good question to ask yourself right now is, why would lipids need to be packaged with proteins to travel in the blood? So that's something to think about. Now, gamma globulins are not made by the liver. They are made by what are called plasma cells, which is an activated B lymphocyte. So gamma globulins are actually what are called antibodies. So they function in immunity. The last category is fibrinogen, and you have very little of it. Only about 4% of your plasma proteins are fibrinogen. And we're going to be talking about those later in this chapter when we talk about blood clotting. So plasma proteins are hugely important, not just to the function of the plasma, but in multiple different ways. Your immune system, your blood pressure. Nothing is just a perfectly straight line in this class. All right, what else do we have in here? We've got our nitrogenous waste products. We've got nutrients. We've got our respiratory gases that we'll get to in a couple chapters. There's those hormones that we finished up 251 with. Okay. So plasma is mostly water, but it's going to be the solutes that are dissolved in it that are going to give it its true functionality. All right, let's talk about red blood cells, or erythrocytes. Erythrocytes have a very specific shape. They are what's called a biconcave disc. So picture a kind of like a donut, but you haven't really smashed out the middle yet. There's still a little bit in there. They're very small. So you're looking at only about 7.5 micrometers. So in terms of a cell, they are incredibly small cells. But if you come down here and you look here, this is a capillary with 2 red blood cells in it. And you can see how very, very small these capillaries are. So having a cell that is both small and flexible is going to be really important. Now, erythrocytes are, in their mature form, anucleate. So A means no nucleus. So there's no nucleus here. Now, they had one as they started, and then during their maturation process, it got thrown out along with all the other organelles. So this means that there's going to be some consequences for a mature erythrocyte. Things to think about. How are they going to get their energy? So are they going to be able to use aerobic respiration, or are they only going to be able to use anaerobic respiration? So you got to think about, okay, well, what organelles are involved there? Are they going to be able to go through mitosis? Questions to ask yourself. So there's certainly going to be consequences to not having a nucleus or any organelles. But what it does is it makes the cell very specialized to carry oxygen, and that's where the protein hemoglobin comes in. Hemoglobin is what you find inside of a red blood cell. We don't have a nucleus, we don't have any organelles, we have a solution of hemoglobin. Now, because red blood cells make up about 45% of blood, they are the major contributing factor to what's called blood viscosity. This is a concept we're going to come back to when we talk about blood pressure. Viscosity simply means how thick something is. So anything that dramatically increases the amount of red blood cells is going to increase the thickness. And then you can begin to think, okay, well, if my blood just got thicker, what's that going to do to my heart? Heart's going to have to pump harder to move thicker blood. Therefore, blood pressure is going to go up. Okay, so you start looking at how everything is involved with something else here. Nothing is a standalone at this point. So let's talk about hemoglobin for a second. Beautiful quaternary protein structure here. So you should remember that protein structure has 4 layers, and quaternary is when you have multiple polypeptides coming together to form your functional protein. So here we have 4 what are called globins, 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. So the alpha are the 2 purple, beta are the 2 gold. Each one contains a heme group that looks like this, where we have an iron molecule. Now, hemoglobin binds reversibly with both oxygen and carbon dioxide. The heme group is where oxygen is going to bind. The globin is where CO2 binds. So they do not compete for a binding spot, and that is important in terms of having a protein that can carry both. So let's talk about what's called erythropoiesis, or the process of making new red blood cells. We start off with a hematopoietic stem cell. Hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis is the process of making blood cells. A subset of that would be erythropoiesis, which is specifically making red blood cells. So we're going to start with a stem cell that is committed to becoming a blood cell. So remember how stem cells work. Once they are committed to a particular pathway, they cannot go backwards. So we have stem cells in our bone marrow, the red bone marrow, that are committed to becoming blood cells. They cannot go back and be anything other than a blood cell. So that's what we start with here. Now, this entire process is under hormonal control, and the hormone here is called erythropoietin, which is usually going to be abbreviated EPO. So we're going to need erythropoietin, and then we need specific dietary requirements. We need iron, we need vitamin B12, folic acid, and just basic nutrition in order for the cells to make their way through this process from a stem cell to a mature erythrocyte. So you can see that the nucleus does exist for a period of time, and then eventually it fragments, it gets sent out, and we end up with that mature anucleate red blood cell. Now, what exactly is going to trigger this process? Basically, anything that is going to cause what's called hypoxia. Hypoxia means your tissues are not getting enough oxygen. There's a lot of reasons for hypoxia to occur, and we're going to look at a few of them here in a minute. But let's talk about what this loop looks like. Hypoxia is going to stimulate your kidneys and to a much smaller extent your liver to release EPO. EPO is a hormone. It's going to target the red bone marrow, and when it does so, it is going to cause your red bone marrow to increase the output of red blood cells. And as your red blood cells enter into your blood, you should be able to increase the amount of oxygen that you're carrying to the tissues, and that's going to bring us back into our homeostatic level of oxygen, and using negative feedback, everything's going to shut off. Now let's look at this process for a second. Okay. Let's say that we have hypoxia because we don't have enough red blood cells. Maybe we just had a big injury, we've lost some blood, and we don't have enough red blood cells. So we release EPO, targets the bone marrow, increase the number of red blood cells, oxygen goes up, boom. That is a great situation. That is how this works. Now, let's say we are hypoxic because we don't have enough hemoglobin. So not necessarily that we don't have enough cells, but that we don't have good functioning hemoglobin in our cells. Well, that is also going to trigger this, and you're going to end up with more red blood cells. Might it help your oxygen carrying capabilities? Maybe. Might it also cause you to have way too many red blood cells? Probably. And then that is going to affect your blood pressure. So that's not quite as good as the first one. Now, let's say that we're hypoxic because we don't have oxygen available. So this isn't a problem with our hemoglobin. It's not a problem with the number of red blood cells. We have emphysema, and we can't undergo gas exchange in our lungs the way that we should. So we don't have enough oxygen in our blood. That is going to trigger the kidneys to release EPO. It's going to target your bone marrow. You're going to make a bunch of red blood cells, and the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood is really not going to get a lot better because the problem didn't lie in your blood. The problem lies in your lungs. You can't undergo gas exchange. This is a really good example of something we're going to see over and over and over again in this semester. Your body has a set response to a given trigger. When you become hypoxic, you release EPO. It may or may not help the situation. It might, in fact, make it worse. And if you have emphysema, just pushing out tons of EPO and dramatically increasing the viscosity of your blood is not going to make things better. And in fact, it's probably going to make them worse. So this is a concept that we're going to see a lot of, is that there's no way for us to tell our body, no, wait, don't release EPO because this doesn't have to do with the number of red blood cells. This actually has to do with our lungs. There's no way to make that distinction. The trigger is hypoxia. The response, the set stereotyped response, is to release EPO. So it may or may not help depending on what the cause was, but there's no way to distinguish that in the body. So this is definitely a concept that we're going to see multiple times, really significantly in this cardiovascular unit, but then a handful of times throughout the semester as we go. Okay, so let's talk about the life cycle of a red blood cell. Once they're made, they are going to circulate for about 120 days. And then they are going to just kind of really essentially get old and worn out. And they're not going to be flexible, which, remember, that shape and flexibility is really important. And their hemoglobin is just not going to be working the way that it should. And so they're going to get trapped in the liver and in the spleen. And there's going to be a whole population of macrophages in there that are going to begin this process of just breaking them down. The hemoglobin is going to be broken down in a multi-step process. The globin is just going to be turned into amino acids. You can make new proteins out of those, basically, recycling the parts, if you will. The heme group is going to get broken into biliverdin, which will eventually, through several processes, end up in the fecal matter. And then the iron is going to get stored and reused eventually for making new red blood cells. So this concept of a finite lifespan in cells is not usually what we see. But remember that red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They can't undergo mitosis, so they can't fix anything that they need to fix here. About some disorders that have to do with red blood cells. Basically two versions. The first that we're going to talk about is anemia. So anemia is just an umbrella term. It's talking about the fact that the blood doesn't have enough oxygen carrying capacity in it. And we can divide anemia into three sort of categories based on what's going on. The first would be due to the loss of blood. So a hemorrhagic event, trauma, something like that, or a chronic hemorrhage event, something like a bleeding ulcer. These are going to be due to an actual loss of your blood cells. Hemophilia would fall into this category. So something that causes you to abnormally lose the number of red blood cells that you have. Low red blood cell production means that for some reason we're not making our red blood cells to the level we should. So iron deficiency falls into this category. So you've got, if you don't have your basic requirements, and iron is one of them, then you're not going to be able to make red blood cells. Pernicious anemia also is sort of related in terms that it's dietary, but this one is actually related to a problem in your stomach. So vitamin B12 can only be absorbed from your food in conjunction with a molecule released by your stomach called intrinsic factor. If your stomach isn't working and you've got gastric atrophy or something like that, you don't have intrinsic factor, then you're not going to be able to absorb vitamin B12. Therefore, you're going to be anemic, and that's called pernicious anemia. Renal would have to do with a lack of EPO, so your kidney is not responding by pumping out EPO properly. Aplastic anemia would be a problem with your bone marrow. So the kidneys are sending out the EPO, but the target cells are not functioning properly. Aplastic anemia is definitely a common side effect with cancer treatments where we irradiate the bone marrow in order to do transplants and things like that. Last one is what we're going to call then, you're going to look at the opposite, high red blood cell production. And you're saying, well, how can you have not enough oxygen and a high red blood cell production? So the key here is that it's high red blood cell production, not necessarily high red blood cell count. Okay? These are termed hemolytic. So you are producing red blood cells at a very abnormally high level because they're dying. So even though the production is very high, the actual count or number of red blood cells is low. So this can happen during drug reactions, poisoning. This happens during the wrong ABO transfusion reactions. And then there are also hereditary conditions that cause this. So thalassemia is a hereditary condition that is going to cause a problem with either the alpha or the beta chain in the hemoglobin, which is going to make the hemoglobin variably functional. Some people have it more severely than others, but because the hemoglobin isn't functioning very well, the red blood cells aren't going to live very long, and therefore these people have a very high rate of production. Sickle cell anemia also falls into this category. This is another genetic condition. So this is a recessive condition that causes the shape of the hemoglobin to change under low oxygen conditions, and that is going to create significant issues and what are called sickle cell crises in individuals that have that. But again, the key underlying idea is that the cells are dying well before their 120-day lifespan. So therefore, the rate of production is much higher. All right, the kind of opposite end of this is what's called polycythemia. This is where you have too many red blood cells. Your count is too high. Primary polycythemia is due to bone marrow cancer. So cancer is an uncontrolled growth. The bone marrow is where we make red blood cells. So bone marrow cancer is going to lead to too many red blood cells. Secondary is going to be related to something outside of the bone marrow. And oftentimes secondary is going to be also a temporary situation. So, for example, decreases in oxygen. Well, if we all get on a plane and we hop over there to Denver and we get off the plane, we are all going to be somewhat hypoxic because we're not getting as much oxygen with each breath. The partial pressure of oxygen is going to decrease as you go higher in the atmosphere. So, for a very temporary period of time that we are in Denver, we're going to dramatically increase our red blood cell count because we're going to feel like we don't have enough oxygen. It's temporary though. Increased EPO. So if you have a kidney tumor that is abnormally secreting EPO, again, this is that loop I'm talking about. The response to EPO is the target cells make more red blood cells. There's no way to tell the target cells, no, 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 don't do that this time. This is actually an abnormal secretion. They simply respond by making more red blood cells. So kidney problems can cause secondary polycythemia. Another thing that would cause this would be blood doping. So here we're talking about usually high-level athletes that either inject EPO or they will kind of abnormal. Another thing that can cause this would be blood doping. So this is usually going to be found in high-level athletics. Here, people are either injecting EPO directly or stimulating their own EPO by removing their own blood. And the logic behind it is the more oxygen I can get to my skeletal muscles and my cardiac muscle, the more efficient and better they will function. And that is, in fact, good sound logic. The problem occurs when you begin to look outside of that straight line logic. The problem occurs when you think about, well, wait a minute, what's going to happen if I artificially increase the number of red blood cells in my blood? That's going to flip that ratio on its end, and suddenly my blood is going to be 55% red blood cells and only 45% plasma by comparison. That means my viscosity has gone through the roof. And viscosity is going to cause your heart to have to work a lot harder. So the workload on the heart has gone up, which means blood pressure is going to have to go up. So if you think about when the population of people that are doing this is somebody who's already going to tax their cardiovascular system at a crazy high level. And then when you add that in, you basically have a recipe for a heart attack. And that is how some people have actually died. It's a really good example of how you gotta look to both sides. You have to see, okay, well, this is the thing I'm concerned with, more oxygen. But you also have to pay attention to viscosity and blood pressure. The effect of those two things on your heart, and if you fail to do that, it could be a fatal mistake.